I really appreciate you taking the time this morning, Genevieve, to join me for this exciting conversation.
Well, I'm excited too. I mean, we'll see where this goes, I guess.
I tend to get to the heart of people really quickly, Genevieve. Get ready. Because the first question I always ask is actually about your own experience with education. Those of us who have made education our careers, I'm
Mhm.
always fascinated as to your origin story with education. Like, where did you go to school when you were younger? What did you like school? Was school a place you felt was interesting and safe? Like, some people come to education as a career because they noticed that there were issues or they had difficulties during the schooling process, or because they liked it and they found an affinity. What was your
Mhm.
experience in early education as a child?
Um, to be honest, I don't have that many memories or vivid memories of my education as a child. I just remember liking school, being very studious and serious about, doing well in school. I think that was, in some way, my way of uh, making sure my parents were happy with me,
Mm.
do well in school. But I did like it. I liked going to school. I liked studying, and I remember to this day, how neat I was at the time taking notes and copying my notes with different color pens and different things like that. Like I took a great deal of time to be neat about it, kind of thing, which is not who I am today, but that's how I was at the time. So yeah, I always liked school. I don't know. Uh, for me, it was always like, of course, I'm
Mm.
I'm gonna continue. I'm gonna go to university, and that's just part of the path that is ahead of me without necessarily giving it a lot of thought.
Well, you mentioned your parents and this idea of making them proud or pleasing them. And I definitely had that growing up and
Mhm.
that connection to school. And it's interesting because usually around this time when we start talking about our experiences with education, our early experiences, this idea of what success, like what did it mean to be good at school? Like we seem to
Mhm.
formulate these opinions and understanding of what it means to be good in
Yeah,
these contexts very early.
yeah,
Um, and to your point, being neat, being very organized
yeah.
and making sure that your parents were pleased with the results that you were producing. What was the narrative in your house? Like my parents' overarching narrative was school is your job. So I go to work, you go to
Mhm.
school. It's, we work hard at what we do because it's important and so on. What was the overarching message around schooling in your house?
I think it was, you know, kind of taken for granted that you were going to go to school and do well. My parents were not against me getting a job when I was 16 or 17. But for most of university, I wasn't working, for instance. I was just at home. Actually, I stayed home with my mom and, studied at university. And at some point, I took a job just because I guess I felt like it. But
Mm,
it was at the university,
mm,
and it was I don't think it was ever, said explicitly, your job is to study, but there was never any pressure on me to do anything but studying.
mm.
Yeah.
What was the connection between made for you? Because just like most of our experiences in that nurturing capacity as young children, we're told a lot of stories. What was the story around the connection between school and work in your house? Like, was school something you had to do so that eventually you were going to get a job and you could make money and you could be independent? Like, what was, because now we both work in the industry of higher education. And
Hmm.
there is this, the triple helix model of the inextricable connection between higher education, post-secondary education, and the workforce.
Yeah.
It is connected, this idea of getting a job, but how connected, up for debate. And in each family, that also can, in each person and each family, that can also look and sound very different.
Right.
What was that story told for you in your house? That was there that connection explicitly made between you have to make money when you get older, you have to have a job, and that's what education is going to afford you.
So I think for my parents, my parents were middle class, both university educated. And so I think for my mom in particular, it was more like you go to university to get a good job, right? As opposed
Mm-hmm.
to any job. And so for her, I think it was, if you want to do well in life, if you have a university degree, you're going to have better working conditions and so on and so forth. I think for her, it was important that we um, get to a white collar job kind
Mm.
of. I think that was it. It was never for the sake of getting an education proper, although, mm, you know, my household was a place where we could debate ideas and political movements and so on and so forth. And my mom, as a social worker, had a bit of a social justice mindset, and so maybe that played a role, but I don't feel like it was explicit. I feel it was more about, so you can get a good job,
Mm.
emphasizing the good
Yeah.
in their job at the time, right? Because at the time, having a university degree really set you apart.
Yes.
Yeah,
Yes. Which arguably is not the case
that's
anymore,
right.
depending
That's
on the type of degree, the nature of the degree.
right.
Uh, it's interesting because there's this emphasis on the importance of school, but also this interesting undercurrent of it's just something you get through. Like you get
Right.
through it, right? It's a thing, it's a designation, it's a credential, and the credential
Mhm.
has value. And we
Right.
hope you can succeed in quotation marks, whatever that means and looks like in terms of your progression through that process. But where did you first encounter this idea of higher education? Because now you work in this field. I mean, you have a really wonderful, what I'm excited to talking to you today is you have so many different lenses that you bring to this conversation around education and the revolution of education as it currently is evolving in the world, because you're a parent, so you have a child who's in a system that's in that kind of system of education. You also operate and work within systems at higher education. You've also taught, so you have that administrative side of things, but you also have the instructor side of things, and then of course you've been a learner, right, in
Mhm.
the system.
Mhm.
So you've got so many different lenses and experience hats that you could put on in terms of the experience. But when did you first encounter this idea of like, hey, maybe school should be a place where we learn how to think? Like maybe we should learn how to be kind to each other, or how to speak to each other, how to collaborate with one another, and how to
Mhm.
learn, because
Yeah.
that's not necessarily part of what we've been talking about thus far and
Yeah.
how we've experienced education.
I mean, to tell you the truth, I think very late, very late. So what happened was that when I finished my bachelor's degree in linguistics, my goal was to um, become a teacher, a French teacher. Uh, and at the time, there was some reorganization of how the B.Ed was going to work. And I always thought, as I was doing my degree, that I could take one extra year to get my certification and become a teacher. But it became the case that um, the Bachelor of Education changed so much that they said, no, you have to start from scratch and basically do another 3 years to become a teacher. And I thought that was not a good way forward for me. So for that reason and a few other reasons, I ended up instead doing a master's degree in education elsewhere in the States. And then I think at the time it was rather instrumental still, because I wanted to stay in the United States. I was on a student visa. I wanted to become a teacher. And so I did that. And then after that, I was faced with, well, okay, what do I do with this? Because going back to Quebec, I still have the same problem I had before, which is to get that degree to be certified in the province. So let me continue. I'm good at school. Let me continue to a PhD program. And so I think it is at some point during that PhD program, I can't remember for like very vividly, but by taking courses and meeting my professors and getting a chance really to be a bit more engaged with ideas, that I probably developed that notion that, an education was useful to develop one's critical mind. So I was very much a late bloomer. And the interesting part relative to your first question is that for the first time, I'm thinking, well, I always thought I just didn't have a plan and kind of went with it and stuff. And this is very much true. But at the same time, I'm like, okay, well, given the sort of philosophy around education that my parents gave me, implicitly, it's not that surprising that it took me a long time to understand an education as a place for developing my own critical thinking.
Yeah, it's interesting how, and this is one of the reasons why I start with that question, because it's fascinating to see almost every single person I speak to, there are threads that get pulled from the very beginning.
Yeah.
This is what I believed education was, because that's the story. These are the types of stories that were told to me culturally.
Mm-hmm.
And it's incredible how sometimes so subconsciously how those stories are woven into our decision-making patterns
Mm-hmm.
as we
That's right.
age and as we continue to age. And they still exist in my head,
Yeah.
because they are so powerful, these things that we communicate to children
Mm-hmm.
around school. On that note, how have you framed school, if you don't mind me asking? How have you framed school for your son? Has this kind of work that you've done now, and this idea of developing a critical mind, do you
Mm-hmm.
still feel yourself emphasizing like it's important your notebook is clean, that you're organized, that you're, that's what success looks like? Or have you expanded it to be like, how are you treating human beings? Are you taking time to reflect and understand what your strengths and weaknesses are? I know he's still very young, but
Yeah. I'm not doing the latter very much, honestly, not explicitly. So here you go. Um, but I think for me, I think my son knows it's important that um, he lives up to his potential.
mm,
Uh, and that's sometimes a source of frustration for me because he's good in school, he's always liked it, he's in grade 6 now, so he's still very much developing, and I think in some areas where he's not motivated to apply himself, he doesn't live up to his potential, and
mm,
that really frustrates me more so than I always emphasize to him, um, that having A's everywhere is not that important. But if he goes from B minus to B or B plus in a subject matter that he's not struggling with because he's still meeting expectations, but perhaps um, not putting as much effort or time or motivation,
mm,
that I'm prouder of his B plus than the A plus that he consistently gets in math, because
mhm,
that's something that he does relatively easily. So, and I feel strongly that in the elementary years, what's important is really around his social, cognitive, emotional, I would say social emotional development is really important. So how do you deal with kids you don't like, who are quote unquote bullies, and how do you what is there here to learn about yourself and about society, right?
mm,
So I think it's and also him going to a French school in Ontario, the sort of the identity aspect of it all is really important to me. So those are the kinds of things that I talk to him about, not so much, I feel like I'm not yet framing school as a place for him to develop his own critical thinking.
mhm.
um,
Well, these three threads that you just mentioned are also ones that we're attempting to pull in higher education, because all educational environments, there's this notion now, or a revolution, if we want to call it, around the value proposition of higher education not being so content specific or domain specific, but in fact, based on what we're seeing out of the literature and research around development of young adults now for many different reasons, but we can point to technology. And over the last 10 years, there've been a lot of longitudinal studies now that have been carried out since 2010, since the ubiquitous, since cell phones, mobile devices became ubiquitous and social media became ubiquitous. There's those 10-year studies that came out in 2020 that have really highlighted for a lot of people issues around mental health and resilience and the ability for a lot of young people to socially, emotionally regulate, navigate difficult environments such as that. Things like bullying in social media spaces in your early 20s.
Right.
It's very similar in the sense of what we're trying to capacity building. We think is so natural in those elementary junior years to talk about with students. The other threat, so this social emotional piece, the other thing is this process oriented approach. So AI and all these other things that are disrupting, I sometimes look at them like they are disrupting outcomes based assessments. So it's like, what's the ultimate product that I could put on a piece of paper, which now a machine might be able to put on a piece of paper. Right. But it's not important what you can put on the piece of paper. It's what did you do? How did you grow over time? How can you demonstrate growth from, as you said, a B- to a B+, and looking at the process of developing and applying oneself, for example, in a domain area. So the social emotional thread, the process oriented approach, and I can't remember now the third one that you said, but you said another one too.
Around his identity as a Francophone.
Yes, an identity, because so much about education in the higher education sector has been about job-related employment. And now there's this identity crisis for a lot of individuals who are already working. They're already working. Like we work in an institution where we have an overwhelming population of students who have part-time or full-time jobs already. So who am I? And in this world of teaching and learning, like, what am I supposed to be coming out the other side with? There's almost this kind of like, what is the value of this to me as a human being, and how is it adding to myself? So fascinating, hey, how like these things that you're identifying as being important at such a young age are now things that we're trying to work on and develop in the higher education sector.
Well, you're going to make me feel fantastic as a mom when really I'm just navigating things based on intuition. It feels like most of the time,
Intuitive, there's a lot of intuitive movements happening in the world now. Intuitive eating, intuitive working, intuitive. So following your intuition is actually, I think we should not diminish what it means to follow one's intuition, Genevieve, either, because that is something that I think has been undervalued. We could go to a gendered place now too, as well, thinking about how women often will have a sense of intuition in terms of, like you said earlier, your decisions. You thought I was just making random decisions and was moving around and was floating around, but no, you intuitively were following. There were things that you were told, there were things that you wanted, and there was a sense of understanding, innate understanding to it. Well, that is something as a parent I can imagine is very difficult given all of the other forces around you with opinions, with judgments, and social media with all sorts of advice that you probably could get on what it means to be a good parent. So I wouldn't do that.
I was going to say too, I was just reminded of that as you're mentioning, social media being a source of information. This is something that we're now dealing with my son now in grade 6. He's very much influenced by his peers, obviously. They play online together. They watch what I feel are like random YouTubers that have like nothing to contribute of value to me, at least. But they see great value in that. And he's picking up information everywhere. And so I have sometimes to stop and say, well, where did you learn that? And are you sure about this? Or he'll come up with his own theory and position on, the COVID vaccine. And because he's afraid of needles. And so, any argument he can find not to get the booster and so on is a good argument for him. And so I'm struggling to
Wow.
keep like to make him see that, information, because it's out there, is not necessarily good information, while also trying to validate him as a human being and the fact that he does have an opinion. And when he says things like, well, for kids, the COVID booster is not important. We're all healthy. Like, it's hard to debunk or to come up with an argument, because I mean there's some value in what he's saying too. But
Mm.
as a parent, I wish that his source of information was me only, because that would make my life a lot easier.
But again, see, you're already teaching him the critical thinking skills. You're not emphasizing them as saying this is what school is meant to help you develop,
Right,
but
right.
you're identifying that now. And I would say probably arguably when in our generation and before as well, except the inundation of information was probably more limited to like your peer groups, but you were still getting bad information as
Right.
young children in different generations. The difference now is the kind of velocity and volume with which many children at young ages are inundated with a lot of information. But again, this is exactly the same kinds of conversations we're having and we're talking
Mm-hmm,
about
mm-hmm.
needing to have in higher education, because confirmation bias. How do you not just
Right.
seek out information that
Mm-hmm.
that backs up your own opinion? How does
Yeah.
an algorithm actually produce confirmation, an echo chamber
Right,
in
right,
the feeds
right.
that you're looking at? Like all this
Mm-hmm.
kind of, I find technology to be an interesting opportunity through which to communicate and discuss these types of things, albeit
Yeah.
the very frustrating conversations, whether we're talking about QAnon, Trump supporter information, or vaccines, or Minecraft YouTubers.
Right.
But it's interesting how those skills, like as colleagues, I always kind of I always see things through this lens of like skill development, competency frameworks, and this idea that socio-emotional skill sets, collaboration, being able to communicate with each other effectively now are really taking the stage at both the young ages, as they kind of always have at young ages, because that's when we feel it's appropriate to discuss these things. But even more now, we understand that we need to continue doing this as adults. Like, look at the self-help industry now for adults too.
Right.
Like for us, like my feed is inundated with like how to let go and Buddhist philosophy, and like all sorts of stuff around socio-emotional regulation,
Yeah.
uh, and also this idea of growth versus
Mhm.
proficiency and process model, and that this idea of who you are. You're allowed to change who you are. Who you are is, it's important to be rooted. It's important to be grounded. Like, what do you value? But how do you flow in
Mhm.
the world in terms of evolving with all the changes that are happening around us? So I want to just kind of zoom us out now to your role in the administrative world, because knowing that some of these threads, this socio-emotional, this process-oriented approach, and this focus on identity formation are things that we're working on cultivating in higher education. The roles that you have and have had and will have all kind of operate at this level of support.
Mhm.
Now, you could argue that you support instructors, but I would say they're inextricably linked to students, right? They're creating the student experience. So
Mhm.
how do you feel this work is going? I'm going to go to just a general question, see where you take it. How do you think it's going? How do you think
Oh
it's
my
going?
God, Michelle, you're killing me.
Should we pick one? Should we pick one? Let's pick the socio-emotional stuff. How do you feel the higher education sector, working with instructors who then are working with student populations,
Mhm.
how
Mhm.
is it going trying to help instructors better understand, design, develop, and deliver courses that can support a student's socio-emotional well-being a little bit while they're also teaching a content area?
Right. Well, honestly, I'm kind of fatigued by references to COVID, but I will make one here
Okay.
because, and it's true. I mean, so much, there was before COVID and then after, right? So had you asked me that question before COVID, I think I would have said, huh? What are you talking about? Kind of thing. Because it's not something that, unless you were explicitly working like for, let's say, student well-being, or one of those type of units, at least it wasn't in my radar. It wasn't in the radar of the Center for Teaching and Learning that I was part of and still am part of now. During and after COVID, I saw a clear shift in that lived experience that everybody went through, where it was so hard for everyone, that there was recognition that, oh, students are human beings too, or students are human beings first. And so what does that mean for me as an instructor who is also struggling, who is also a human being, who also needs boundaries and, off time and so on and so forth. So I feel like the conversation has definitely shifted to students as whole human beings. So there's tension here, I think, because it can be very taxing on an instructor to care for hundreds of students sometimes, right? And so I often feel like the system itself, with the massification of education and the number of students that we typically see in a first year course, makes it extremely difficult to have a compassionate approach to teaching and learning. But topics like trauma-informed pedagogies, let's say, or we offer something called caring to teach, which is, around compassionate teaching and so on and so forth, and seeing students as human first. I think, yeah, so those things exist now. So that's one thing. I think a lot of instructors are trying to change their pedagogies in a way that accounts for the students' complex lives, and the fact that, they not only have the deadline for this particular assignment, they have someone to care for, they have a job, they have a commute, they have all sorts of things. And really, what is it costing me as an instructor to say, be flexible around deadlines, which is a very simple thing. And so what I find is that instructors, I mean, those are generalizations and I don't like to make them, but it seems to me like, the way we delivered education was like, those are the rules. This is what you must do in order to succeed in this course. A, B, C, and D. That's it. No rationale, more so than say, this is the content. Those are the assessments, and trust me, they're related to one another. And it's due by such a date, because when you are in the real world, you're going to have things due by such a date, and that's the end of the story. Now it's more like understanding that it's kind of a lose-lose approach. The instructor trying to enforce those things without looking around at who's in the room and what are their needs, is just banging their head against the wall and making even their own lives more complicated.
That's just part one of this exciting conversation, my friends. Click on part two and continue with us on this important journey we like to call the education revolution.